Hello, and welcome to The Excerpt. I'm Dana Taylor. There's a scary word that's showing up with increasing frequency lately: authoritarianism. A quick Google search reveals many articles, commentaries, social media posts, and scholarly debates on whether or not America is sliding into an authoritarian state. But is that really what's going on here? Or is calling the current political climate authoritarian simply a case of liberals being melodramatic? Perhaps the question we need to ask ourselves is really, what is authoritarianism? And if it were happening here, what would that look like? Here to help us understand this moment and define what we're actually seeing play out in U.S. politics is Ruth Ben-Ghiat, a professor of history and expert on fascism, authoritarianism, propaganda, and democracy protection at New York University. Thanks for joining me, Ruth.
It's a pleasure.
Let's start with the basics. Take us back to Political Science 101. How is an authoritarian state defined?
So there are two ways you can define it. One is a political definition, and that is when the executive branch kind of overwhelms, overreaches, so that the other branches of government become politicized and become the kind of tools of the personal will of the leader. So the judiciary is purged, the bureaucracy, the civil service is purged, and so only loyalists could be there. And at the extreme cases, you get a parliament or legislature that becomes a rubber stamp of the leader. And the media, of course, in old school, one-party states, there's no opposition, there's no elections. Today, things work a bit differently. But that's one part of authoritarianism. It's a amassing of power by the executive branch and the personal power of the leader. Another thing to look for is authoritarianism as a process where the rights of the many are curtailed or taken away. And by this, I mean voting rights, reproductive rights, rights to free speech, free assembly. And the very few, the cronies, the oligarchs, the billionaires, they end up having a fantastic amount of power and freedom to do what they want and plunder the workforce, plunder the environment, and there's no rules anymore to stop them. So that's another thing that's often overlooked about authoritarianism, but it's really important for understanding how it works today.
And what about fascism and populism? How do these other political systems differ?
So fascism, along with early communism, is really like the first stage of authoritarianism. And, my book, Strongmen, goes over 100 years of authoritarian rules so people can see how it changes. And fascism, came out of World War I, and this was a classic one-party states in Spain and Italy and Nazi Germany with a dictator, no space for opposition whatsoever, expansionism, imperialist wars, violence, all of this. And so this set the tone for authoritarianism, and then it developed into military dictatorships in the Cold War period. It's a whole history of authoritarianism, but today, one-party states are not as common. You have them in China and North Korea, like the communist ones have lasted. But in most places today, you have elections, and it's something called electoral autocracy, where you keep elections going, but you kind of game the system over time, so it's very hard to have free and fair elections, and the leader gets to stay in power.
As you've said, you've studied authoritarian regimes across history. Cutting to the chase, what are some of the early warning signs? And are you seeing any of those signs here in America?
I'm certainly seeing the signs here in America. And in a way, President Trump's first administration was a testing ground, a rehearsal for some of these actions, the kind of amassing of power by the executive branch, the kind of purging, making life difficult for people who were not loyal to him in the State Department and the Environmental Protection Agency. And then, of course, a huge red flag was how Mr. Trump's first presidency ended. He didn't want to leave office, even though he lost the 2020 election, and he staged what is known as a self-coup. And this is when someone in power doesn't want to leave, and so they do something illegal, incite violence, incite an insurrection to stay there. And so based on that, Mr. Trump is an authoritarian, and now he is back and things are proceeding very, very quickly. The firing of non-loyalists from the civil service, the attacks on the judiciary, the kind of disappearance without due process of immigrants and US citizens, the idea of a party, the GOP, which has become a personal tool of Mr. Trump with no dissent possible. There are many other things you can point to, but it's always a process. And that's why it can be hard for people to pick one action and say, okay, now we're in autocracy.
Ruth, as you know, it's not news to say that President Donald Trump admires strong men such as North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un and Russian President Vladimir Putin. Just recently, Trump sat next to Salvadorian President Nayib Bukele, who's called himself the world's coolest dictator. Trump's deportation policy is raising serious questions about apparent abuses of due process and human rights. At what point should Americans be concerned?
I believe they should already be concerned because when US citizens disappear and have no recourse, and their home country simply doesn't care about getting them back. And this was set up by a kind of years of hateful rhetoric against immigrants, dehumanizing anti-immigrant rhetoric. And this happened all through the campaign. And so it prepared the population for mass deportation, the idea that we're going to deport millions of people or detain millions of people. These are all things that happened in the past that were part of the campaign because authoritarians often tell you what they're going to do. And they do this to normalize their abuses. And so now we have this kind of test case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who was recently deported without due process to El Salvador and remains in prison at this time. The United States is not interested in getting him back. And so this kind of scorn for human rights, it's not just a neglect or disinterest, it's actually actively a scorn for rule of law, for the idea that anybody can tell the authoritarian and his government what to do. That's actually the mentality of authoritarians, and we're seeing this unfold.
How do modern authoritarian leaders use democratic systems to gain and consolidate power? Is the U.S. vulnerable to this?
Absolutely, because so we have had in our own country, when I talk about electoral autocracy, where today you don't ban elections, you don't need to ban elections. There are tricks you can do to keep holding elections, but make it very difficult for the opposition party or parties to prevail. So one of the things that can be done is voter suppression. And we have a long history, way before Mr. Trump, of voter suppression, racialized voter discrimination. And the Republican Party has long been very active in trying to get fewer people to vote. In some states, it's very difficult to have what you'd call free and fair elections because of this. And so this is one way. Another thing that modern autocrats do, and it's been done very successfully in Hungary, and Prime Minister Orban is a big role model for the Republicans today, is that you domesticate the media. So you get your rich friends to buy important, media properties. And so the media becomes your friend and not an objective, independent source anymore. And so in Hungary, during the last presidential elections, the opposition candidate, the message hardly reached the mass of Hungarian voters outside big cities because their ideas and their platforms simply weren't carried in the press. They were shut out. So that's an example of how today you don't need to ban elections and you don't need state control of the media like you have in China or North Korea. You have these other ways of making sure that you prevail.
Historically speaking, when people generally think of fascists, they think of Italy's Benito Mussolini and Germany's Adolf Hitler. How do the current political and social dynamics in the United States compare to those in historical fascist regimes?
I'm glad you asked that because in doing a book that goes over 100 years, I discovered these patterns, some of which I didn't expect to discover. To answer the question of, when do autocrats or charismatic demagogues have an appeal? You find that it's when countries have had a lot of change, a lot of social progress, for example. It could be worker rights, more space for unions. It could be racial equity, gender equity. And these are situations where, in the Euro-American context, it's often white males will feel like they're losing something, or elites in general feel like they're losing their privileges. And so that is when a population can become kind of vulnerable to the charms, we could say, of these charismatic demagogues who come up and make themselves the voice of those who are feeling like they're losing something. And so this happened in 2016 in America. We had 8 years of President Barack Obama. We'd never had a Black president before. We had the legalization of same-sex marriage. We had women admitted to combat. We had a female presidential candidate. And this was a lot of change. And so Mr. Trump came up on the scene and said, I will fix this. And he offered something very different, which we're now seeing the unfolding of today.
I want to go back to something you brought up earlier. In your book, Strongman, you discuss the use of propaganda. How has media, including social media, played a role in enabling authoritarian tendencies in the United States?
I think that it's a very interesting question because social media allows propaganda to be spread much more quickly than it used to be. And this is everywhere in the world. Because what you need for propaganda is constant repetition, but with tiny variations so it doesn't get boring. And you think about social media, everybody shares, and they share with a meme or they share with their own twist on the news. And these circuits of rhetoric and propaganda can go very fast too. Social media is fast. And so all of this has really helped propaganda to spread.
Looking ahead to upcoming elections, what are the most critical things people should be watching for that might signal further democratic erosion or recovery?
I think we always want to watch an escalation of voter repression and suppression attempts, making voting more intimidating. We had poll watchers in the idea of armed poll watchers could come back, just trying to disenfranchise more and more people, and that's often done, along with racist or national purity programs. So right now, the idea of birthright citizenship, who should be able to be in the country at all, who should be able to vote. We need to watch things like that. I also think that America is very unusual in the world in that we have only two giant parties. And if one party drastically changes, as has the Republican Party, those who don't agree with those changes don't have anywhere to go. And so it's a bit of a static system. And so many people today are no longer voting. And in any case, the United States has one of the biggest non-voting populations in the world. Something like 80 million people don't vote. And so I think that for the health of any democracy, registering people to vote, talking to people about what voting means, it is your voice. You use it, whatever party you're going to have your voice support, voting is your way of doing that. Because often in a country that's becoming an autocracy, elections are the last thing to go. They're the last thing standing, even when the judiciary has been made a tool of the leader, even when most of the media has been captured by the autocrat, and so it's no longer independent. Elections can still be there for the people to express their political choice.
I appreciate hearing your thoughts on this topic, Ruth. Thank you so much for being on The Excerpt.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. I'm Dana Taylor. I'll see you next time.